Okay, thank you all for coming. I wanted to use this time here to have a conversation to make sense of where we're at with Nostr, where we've come and where we want to be going. And because we're all part of this large collective project and we all see our own little pieces of it. And so I thought a bit of an overview might be very useful. Nostr is created by a community. Community is grown. It's not created artificially. It's not designed from the top down. And especially open technologies and complicated systems like the internet, they don't design well. They emerge. And I thought since Fiat Joff got in trouble for quoting some right-wing Brazilians, I would quote a Brazilian communist, which is, we make the road by walking. And it's a way of referring to how we're building this and that we're building it in the work we're doing. We're building it in the collaboration that we make. We're building in the running of it and how we learn it. And I think it's really important to realize that the process of creating Nostr, of building all these apps and figuring out how they work, that's a process that includes all of us, and that's a process we're figuring out together. And I also, I figured, why not, since I'm being throwing things out there, I figure I'll quote the Bible too. But whatever has happened in the past is now here, and whatever is going to happen in the future is also here. And so, we have cycles of history. It doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. And so we can understand where we are today and where we're going by looking at what has come in the past. So the question of where did Nostr come from, or where did we come from to get here? And one of the things that I remember thinking about, and I don't remember if Jack and I had this discussion, but back at Odeo, there was a discussion about what does emerging media mean and how does it work, and how we looked at past systems that we had liked, and we thought about what it might mean in the era of mobile phones, or what it might mean in the era of what the internet looked like in 2006. And that stuck with me because humanity is a couple 100,000 years old, and we've only had agriculture for 10,000 years. We've had cities for less than that. We've had the nation state, we've had money, we've had, all of these other constructions for a relatively short period of time in our history. But we evolved a long time ago. And so every time we introduce new technologies, we're going to repeat the same sets of human interactions, the same activities, because we're hardwired for that stuff. We're hardwired for community, we're hardwired for stories, we're hardwired for collaboration. And so as we developed new communication technologies from the original cuneiform tablets, which weren't really used for narrative writing at all, they were mostly used for accounting, they were ledgers, to the original papyrus writing, to manually copying books. All of those early stages, a very teeny percentage of the population got to participate in creating media, transposing media. Everybody else just had oral media. And then the printing press came along, and the goal of the printing press was to create dominance by the Catholic Church and bring the Bible to everyone. But what happened was people beyond the Catholic Church got a hold of the printing press, and all of a sudden, this, preacher named Martin Luther started printing his pamphlets and created the Protestant Reformation. So basically, the printing press printed the Bible, which is the most printed book in history, but it also led to the collapse of dominance of the institutions of the Middle Ages. And we see the same thing with the rise of newspapers, where initially it was an idea of bringing everyone together and educating people. And what it did is it ended up changing how power worked in society. Every time these new technologies get introduced, we have moral panics. We have this idea that whatever the past worked, it isn't going to work again. And some of these moral panics seem quaint today. My favorite moral panic was Victorian-era novels, where there was a moral panic about reading too many novels was destroying the intellect of young people, and that legislators needed to do something to stop young people from spending so much time reading novels. And at the same time, or a little bit after that, there was a crusade against coffee shops, because coffee shops were where people got together and they read newspapers and they talked about stuff and they fomented revolutions and they came up with new ideas. And so coffee shops were a very controversial idea, and people had moral panic about the novel. They had moral panic about coffee shops, about it destroying everything that made sense in society and causing us to go into dangerous territories. And so when we think about social media today, we have to realize that history, that is a pattern that has always been there. And we can learn from it, and we can also be a little bit calmer about the moral panics because we know that they keep coming. Another thing to realize is that speech in and of itself doesn't matter. If you're talking to no one in the woods, it doesn't have any effect. It's with the distribution, with the ability to reproduce and share and collaborate. So on the top there's a picture of something called a scuttlebutt. And a scuttlebutt was how tall ships managed to send letters back and forth. Every time two tall ships met at sea, they would look in their barrel, their scuttlebutt, and find all of the letters that were going in the right direction of the other ship and exchange them. And it was a store and forward method of mail that had no central coordination at all. And then eventually we have the telegraph. And, Henry David Thoreau said, "I don't know why you would use a telegraph. Why do I want to talk to someone in Texas if I'm from Maine?" The initial thing was, how are these things useful? What is it going to be? What are we going to communicate? Well, eventually, it meant that it sped things up. It unified things. And some of these technologies aren't just, coffee shops fomenting newspapers and revolutions, but sometimes the technologies have really negative effects that no one who created them thought about, and it took society a long time to figure out what to do about it. The authoritarianism of the 1920s and 30s was not possible without the radio. And we don't talk about that very much today. But in the United States, there was this Catholic priest, Coughlin, who had a radio program that 25% of Americans listened to every single week. And he used that platform to advocate for the United States joining Germany during World War II instead of England. So he wanted the United States to join the Axis. No one in our history books talks about the fact that a quarter of Americans were listening to a long radio program advocating for the United States to be on the other side of World War II. What's also fascinating is he was deplatformed and shadow banned. Seriously, it was the first massive deplatforming and shadow banning where there was a concerted effort, some of it by the government, but a lot of it by people lobbying advertisers and lobbying radio stations to take him off the air. Now, I'm not saying it was a bad thing to deplatform him, but if we want to, this stuff that we're seeing today with social media, it's not new. Another thing that is fascinating when you look at the history of media is the utopian language that goes along with the other side of the moral panics. So the excitement and hope around broadcast television was that it would solve society's problems by unifying everybody under common culture. And if everybody watched the same TV program every night, then we would all have the same sets of ideas and all of society's problems would go away. And in some ways, it did have that effect. It did have this kind of unifying effect of culture. But it didn't, getting everybody on the same page and unified didn't solve all the problems. It didn't make society's conflicts go away. Because when we think about the media, there's a reality which is we have in the West strong protections for free speech, but we don't have strong protections for reach. And that was intentional. You know, the famous quote of, freedom of the press is only guaranteed to those who own them, is that, yes, you can say whatever you want, but you can't get it out to people. And so, Father Conglin, when he went up there, he lost the ability to run his radio programs, and he couldn't put up his own radio towers, and he was effectively silenced. And so that is important when we think about when we're building new things, what are those choke points? Because the choke points are often very technical and a little bit esoteric. When television was introduced, people thought it was killing culture, and it was called sort of, this mindless, blue machine that was spraying ideas and things. But it also brought everybody together, it unified it, and it changed the culture. And every time we introduce new technologies, we shape that technology, and then it shapes us back. It's this cycle. And so when we're designing new things, we need to think about that cycle. There's a meme which is like, you think you just fell out of a coconut tree, and that's kind of funny, but the other part of it is that we all exist in the context of society and history, and it's important to understand that context. So Twitter itself didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of existing things. It came out of existing ideas. It came out of a bunch of people collaborating. And I think if, we hadn't created Twitter at Odeo, someone else would have created something similar because people were experimenting with those similar ideas. There were other companies, Pounce and Jaiku, and people trying to do it. Would it have been the same? No. Would it have had the same structures and affordances and values? Probably not. But something kind of similar would have emerged. So I was going to think about an inspirational quote, but I didn't find one. So I just throw up a picture of Jack on the sailboat. To make sense of what we're building, we need to think about what does it mean to be online with other people. And the best metaphor that I've found is that we are creating digital neighborhoods, because we can think of different neighborhoods or different spaces of having different affordances, having ideas of what's normal and what's good, what's bad. And you can see neighborhoods or digital spaces go from cool to not cool. There was a time in which MySpace was really cool, and then it stopped being cool. There was a time in which Facebook started being really cool, and then everybody's mom joined, and then it was not cool. And so we can learn from academics like Jane Jacobs and people who are urban planners and apply their metaphors, their ideas to designing the social systems, because it's the same people. We are the same people that were sitting around a campfire in a tribal group 10,000 years ago as we are today. Like, we have the same brains, we have the same sets of needs. And so we're the same people who are going out into a cafe or going onto a train or an airplane or into a supermarket. We take that same person and we go into these digital spaces and we look at the design. We look at the norms. We look at the way other people are behaving to know how we should behave in those spaces. And, using this metaphor, I like to think about what each of the big social media platforms are like. What's their physical space analog? And for me, Instagram is like an art gallery. It's very showy, and you are rewarded for aesthetics. Blogging, an older technology, is a lot like an open cafe night. You don't know what you're going to get. Everybody's sort of going on themselves. It's not particularly connected. Tumblr and LiveJournal is like a Comic Con or maybe even a furry convention. It's it's a certain set of alternative culture stuff where people are playful but don't fit into mainstream society. TikTok is Coachella or Tomorrowland, a very large, very well-produced music festival. Twitter, to me, Twitter is the Zeitgeist bar in San Francisco, which is this kind of hipster, a little bit dive bar where there were lots of tables for people to hang out and talk, and it's really loud, and there's lots of stuff going on, and it feels like you're in the center of everything. Facebook has become a municipal community center. It's still there. Some people still go and use it, and in theory, we're better off to have community centers like this, but it's also really sad. Mastodon and the Fediverse is like a D&D game. And the reason I say this isn't just because of the people who use the Fediverse, but also because it's this network of people who set up all these little rules. And so each server, you're like your own little world, and all of it designed, and all of the adventure, and all what you can and can't say, and who can join, everything is designed by the dungeon master. And you don't get any say what the dungeon master is going to do. Maybe the dungeon master gives you a great game, and maybe it's a terrible game. But you don't have much autonomy because you exist in their world. Blue Sky is sort of this attempt at, fully automated luxury gay space communism. It's a particular set of very, very politically correct utopian, but not super interested in diversity beyond a specific set of people. And Farcaster is a casino. I don't know if anybody's ever spent much time on Farcaster, but they raised their money and they started growing a lot when basically they added all of these little cryptocurrency contests. You can post things and learn things, and you make a bet when you join a group, and then you can lose the bet money if you get content reported and stuff. They made it into a game, and most casinos make a lot of money, but only a certain kind of person goes there. And at the moment, Nostr feels like a Bitcoin meetup. And I don't think that has to be the case long term, but I think that is the reality of the moment of where we are. And so part of what I am suggesting we need to do is a kind of redesign of our community. We need to not get rid of the Bitcoin meetup, but we need to build other buildings. We need to build other spaces within our neighborhood. So where are we now? We are very much within the tradition of internet protocols that win and work. There's a phrase: we reject kings, presidents, and voting. We believe in rough consensus and running code. That is the motto of the IETF that designed the internet. David Clark, who said it, he was the person who designed TCP/IP. And when we think of TCP/IP, we think of it just as a fundamental thing that has always existed. What we don't realize was that TCP/IP was the Rabble protocol that refused to do the right thing. TCP/IP was the poorly designed shit protocol, and the government wanted everyone to use OSI. None of us remember OSI. But at the time, it was very controversial because there were these architecture astronauts who were designing the perfect internet architecture for how it all worked, where it was all very controlled. And then a bunch of hackers came along and created TCP/IP. And the internet we have today exists because we have these layers of decentralized protocols. It's important when we think about Nostr to realize that open and messy wins. We have these specs, but we also have this massive community of people who are trying shit. In Nostr, you can create your new kind and you can start writing to it. You can write whatever you want out to these messages. In the Blue Sky at proto, which is very similar to Nostr, you have to write a schema validator. And you have to get a spec approved, and you have to put that on a bunch of different servers at different levels in the stack in order for a new message type to even work. And that is a fundamental difference in sort of how you think about things. But the complicated big parts of the internet, those all grew up from these messy, hacky things that were easy to build on. And so that's part of what drew me to Nostr, and I think we should celebrate it. And we shouldn't let people say, "Oh, this isn't going to scale." I was involved with Ruby on Rails, and everyone would say Ruby on Rails isn't going to scale. And we figured out the scaling problems. Shopify is Ruby on Rails. Like, the things that work are the things that are put together in pieces. The internet we have today is small pieces loosely joined. Nostr is small pieces loosely joined. Nostr is internet native in a way that is very different than the big Web 2.0 platforms that run on top of the internet, but they don't run like the internet. Nostr is also based on a protocol that almost no one used called Secure Scuttlebutt. And Fiat Joff, it used to be in the README file when you looked at it, said, Secure Scuttlebutt is really interesting. It does a bunch of interesting stuff, but there are things that are holding it back. In Scuttlebutt, it was very hard to use your same key in multiple apps at the same time, the way we do in Nostr a lot. It was also impossible to delete because it had this signature chain. And the relays in Scuttlebutt were an add-on. But Nostr isn't the only protocol that was inspired by Scuttlebutt. Blue Sky was also inspired by Scuttlebutt, but they did it differently. They're the cathedral model of open source. In order to develop for Blue Sky, you can use it, you can make a client, but they say in their contributor files, we don't want contributions of substance because it is not created by a community. It's used by a community. Nostr is the other side. Nostr is the bazaar. We don't have a king or a president or voting. We build things up. We collaborate. Nostr is built like the internet that works. And so I get asked this a lot, like, how do you compare these? Where does Nostr sit in this larger ecosystem? And you can see that there are some real differences here. But the biggest one is just if you did the same thing with a different philosophy. If you decide to try and build a bottom-up decentralized protocol in a top-down way, and we're building a bottom-up decentralized protocol in a bottom-up way. Lastly, there's Threads, which has tried to join all of these protocols and everything else. And I have it on good authority that the Threads code is just a bunch of if-else statements in the Instagram code base. It's like, is this text, is this an image? And it has, like, I don't understand everyone who is leaving Twitter and going to Threads, because don't we have enough evidence over 15 years of Facebook and Meta lying and making false promises and chasing growth at all costs? Like, why do we want to give them more platforms? And why do we trust them that they really will open up to these open standards? Because remember, Facebook was part of the coalition that did activity streams, the precursor to ActivityPub. There was a time when Facebook supported those open protocols, and then they're like, oh, we don't have to support them anymore because we're big enough to ignore the open community. The history of software development, especially the history of the internet, has been a history of pendulum swings between centralization and decentralization. We had mainframes and then microcomputers and personal computers, and we had CompuServe, and then we had FidoNet and BBSs. We are constantly swinging back and forth between the two. And there is a power fight and a technology fight that goes back and forth. And so we have seen the problems of extreme centralization, where all of your apps are provided by a server and then it gives it to you and it executes in your browser, in your local machine. But all the complicated stuff lives in some central server. The world of everything is handed to you on the fly and runs in the browser is not that different than the old world of mainframes, because whoever controls that central server has all the power. So when we think about Nostr, we need to realize that we need to build a kind of sustainable future, and that we have the pieces to do that. And I've been spending a lot of time thinking about how do we talk to people about Nostr, and the complicatedness of talking to people about it as a censorship-resistant free speech protocol. Because most people think that someone did something bad to get their content moderated, or they want to say some offensive, dangerous thing. And so, as important as it is that we have that censorship resistance and that we have that control and that free speech, no one goes and searches out a platform for that in large numbers. But what they do want is they want fun apps to use. And Nostr is very different than Farcaster, or Blue Sky, or some of these others, or the Mastodon, because of the amazing array of apps we have. The true tragedy of the Commons for Web 2.0 was that it was enclosed by platforms. The early days, there were open APIs. There were open systems that you could collaborate. You could pull data from one system to another. And the early implementation of the APIs at Twitter, you just used your username and password. And so Twitter couldn't shut down third-party apps because it didn't know the difference between you using a web browser or TweetDeck. But eventually, OAuth got set up, which was supposed to protect users and help them so they weren't sharing their passwords, and that shifted the power. And that was the thing that ended up being useful to shifting all of the power back into centralized control. So if we think of Nostr as an app platform, then we realize that we are winning because we have all of these amazing apps. We have so many things that collaborate and work, and they're really good. Now, are they perfect? No. Is it figuring out how to log into them hard? Yes. But people tend to be blown away when we show them all of the things that you can do. And in our user testing, the thing that blew people's mind is when we signed them up for Nosocial or Primal or Damus, and then we showed them how to get their NSEC, and we put it in another app, and we showed them that it was the same content, and that other app was by a different person with different preferences, with different design, with different functionality. That's the mind-blowing thing about this. And that's why we're all collaborating together instead of just building our own little walled gardens. So I don't think we talk about this amazing array of apps enough. I don't think we talk about it in our apps. I know that in Nosocial, when you join and start using it, we don't encourage you to discover other apps of different kinds. We have built this amazing ecosystem, and the users can move between it, but we haven't quite figured out how the apps connect. Like, back when Facebook's platform was all these apps, Facebook did a pretty good job of letting you discover that there were different apps. Like, oh, your friend is playing Farmville. You might want to play Farmville. All those kind of things. And so we need to figure out in the Nostr ecosystem how to support each other and how to make discovery of all these different apps easy and how to make it easier to discover what your friends are using and migrate to start using them. One of the amazing things, though, that we discovered was copying around an NSEC and putting it into a secure place. That turns out is not hard for non-technical users. It's a little bit dangerous if they put it in a web browser thing, and figuring out how to set up a Chrome extension was a bit dangerous and hard. But copy the app from one mobile app to another, like that NSEC, that was not a hard concept for people. It's a hard concept for people who understand public key cryptography. It's a hard concept for people who think about wallets. Because if you know what's going on, you're like, oh my God, what are you doing? But if you don't know what's going on, you're like, this is a magic string that I put from one app to the other, and all of a sudden, all of my data and everything is in the other app. It's just like a magic connecting string. So I think we got too worried about this. And we just kind of need to embrace the fact that it'll be this messiness. Now, as excited as I am about Nostr, I want to be very clear about where we are in the larger ecosystem. So I pulled up some stats. It's hard to know how much is going on in the Nostr ecosystem, but this is, the daily active users. In July, we were closer to 18,000. We dropped down a little bit in August. In weekly active users, we've been averaging about 40,000 weekly active users. We don't know really how many users we have because most people who use social media never post anything. They never publish, they never like, they never reply. It's entirely a consumer experience. And so those users are invisible in these stats. Well, let's look at a couple of the other platforms. This is the Blue Sky user numbers. And, first off, you can see that it is higher. We don't know how many people are logging in, but we don't know how many people are liking. And so it's roughly 200,000 people seem active and doing stuff on Blue Sky. But look at the way the graph works. Blue Sky gets a bunch of press, and a ton of people sign up, things happen, they spike up, and then slowly goes down. Look at our user graph. We're not so high, but we are not spiking up because of one particular event. We're not getting a ton of press and sort of a ton of attention. We are growing organically. And to me, that's a really positive thing, as much as I wish we were at several 100,000 users instead of 40,000. Lens is another sort of Ethereum-based decentralized social media network. It's also inspired by Scuttlebutt. And if you look at their growth, they're actually consistently shrinking. And I think that's because they got outpaced by Farcaster, who were in exactly the same community as the early adopters. But Farcaster, who raised over $150 million in venture capital money a couple months ago, and it is even less open than Blue Sky's development. If you look at their use, it's not trending up in the right direction. So where are we at with the Nostr current community? Right now, we've designed Nostr to have one big community. It operates in a bunch of different languages, but it's essentially Bitcoiners. And if you look at it, there's a lot of talk about Bitcoin. But when it comes to Nostr, Bitcoin is a feature. Zaps are a feature. They get you two things. They're great, but they're not going to drive adoption to people who don't care about it, and people need to find stuff and be able to connect other things. So where are we going? We need to go from this network of apps that are possible to things that are easier to use. It is remarkably hard to make really easy to use software for people. It requires a lot of work. in particular, it requires talking to people, talking to humans, and not just scratching your own itch. Like, Pablo, I think you're amazing. I love all the things you do, but you're the prototyper who figures out everything. And then we need another community of people who takes all those prototypes and figures out what they make sense to users and how do we adapt them. And we have done a lot of user interviews in the last year around Nostr. We have done hundreds of times of sitting down and walking people through onboarding the apps and talking to them and understanding their social media states and what do they think about in 2024. And people want things that are fun. People want things that are playful. They want connection. They want connection to real people. They want to feel like they're connected. They want meaning. They're, you know, that's the problem with some of the Farcaster casino stuff is it's just like make little bits of money. And much to my surprise as a Bitcoin skeptic, they want an economic model and they want the micropayments. People want the ability to send and receive money between people. Like people who do not care about Bitcoin, they don't care about central banks, they're not engaged in all of it. When we're like, the economic model is you can pay for services and support it and run micropayments, they're happy because it means they're not looking into the advertising world. They need that alternative. They're desperate for an economic model that isn't selling them to advertisers. And this is good because we have an economic model. We have a system of payments that none of these other things, well, Farcaster does, but people don't want to feel trapped. They don't want to feel alienated and isolated. They don't want to feel like they're living in this sort of automaton world in which they're just being products that are bought and sold. They want to feel their humanity, and that's the root of a lot of the backlash against large language models in AI is not, oh, this is cool, like we've taken all of the creation of humanity and we get to create new stuff together. It's feeling like it's exploitive. It's pulling out of their things. And people don't like that. People want community, and people want contradictory things. So when we onboard creators, and we've done this a lot in the last year, of talking to them and setting it up, the thing they care most about is how easy it is going to be published and use this thing, and how do I build an audience? And so they want the algorithm. The algorithm is what helps build them an audience in an easy way. It makes it easier to do. And they hate the algorithm because then they become dependent on it. So we often only hear the I hate the algorithm part. But what creators look at when they look at Nostr is like, well, how do I find people to follow me? How do I cultivate that community? Where do they discover it? And we don't have great tools for that. You know, this is what I was saying, that they want the micropayments. But a lot of people distrust Bitcoin. They distrust it because they've heard of articles about the environmental impact. They distrust it because it feels like it's a sort of an inward-looking community. They distrust it because of other cryptocurrencies scams that go on. And so what we found was if we just talk about zaps and lightning payments and sending it between people, they're like, yeah, this is great. If we tell them it's a Bitcoin wallet, they're like, fuck that. And so that's really telling. It doesn't mean that we can't have Primo, which says it's a Bitcoin wallet first and, oh, it does some social stuff, which is sort of how they present themselves on their webpage. But it means that we also need a whole bunch of apps and a whole bunch of things that do the other thing, which is just like, oh yeah, this is the feature and how it works. The mind-blowing thing I talked about earlier is the way NSECs are passed between users and the way in which you can use all these apps together. It is a very different conceptual thing, and it excites people, and it's powerful. And users, especially non-technical users, they really need it to be incredibly intuitive. Like the amount of time we spend doing user testing and we need to like find out the edge cases is overwhelming. So where are we going with Nostr? My vision of Nostr is how do we migrate it from a Bitcoin meetup to Christiana. Christiana is a community in Copenhagen that was a military base that in the 1970s a bunch of people went in and squatted. And they said, we're going to build our houses there, we're going to build businesses here, and our businesses in our world of Christiana, they don't follow Danish law. So there's an open-air drug market where in Denmark, drugs are illegal. But they're like, in Christiana, we're going to have different rules of commerce. We're going to have our space where we control it. We're going to have different rules about free speech. And there's going to be a diversity of things that are here. And it's going to be fun, and there's going to be art, and there's going to be commerce, and all these things. And I think Nostr could be that. So how do we create that? We build it together, collaborating, and we build it in a system that we don't all have to agree. We all don't have to ask permission. But we do need to collaborate and learn from each other. And we need to listen to our users. We need to do more talking to users. One of our projects over the last few months was running a creator and journalism accelerator where we reached out to hundreds of creators and journalists, and we worked on onboarding them to Nostr. We set them up with wallets, we set them up with accounts, we figured out which of the apps made most sense. Some of them used Nostr, but a lot of them used other apps. And we then highlighted all of those users and those accounts and helped them build the audience. That's how we discovered the love-hate relationship to algorithms. Because at first, they're like, oh, I just hate the algorithm. And then they join Nostr and they're like, how do I build an audience? Why isn't there an algorithm helping me find people? And here, this is some examples of some of the folks we've onboarded in a directory. Another thing that came up a lot in user interviews and stuff is delete and edit. Users want these things. Users don't care that they're not real. Like, as technologists, we're like, well, this isn't really ever going away, and what happens to it in versions like that? They're okay with that messiness because it's the social signal. Users really want private groups. We are seeing increasing number of people who are operating on the dark forest vision of the internet, which is there are scary, dangerous things out there, especially with large language models and bots, and I want to be able to decide who joins my community, and I want to be able to have privacy. I think Will's going to talk more about this later, but like the ability to have a private group of everybody who follows me and who I follow, and I can post to them, and then I could also post publicly to everybody. That's something that doesn't exist on the big corporate social media platforms, but we can do it on Nostr. Like, there's a lot, like once we set up the technology, there's a lot we can do. And we need programmable spaces. We have that. We have this hackable space that's amazing. I go to Alcoholics Anonymous, and the 12th step of it is that having had a spiritual awakening, which is what it feels like to join the Nostr community and figure it, that it's our responsibility to figure out the right way to carry that to other people. Nostr doesn't have a marketing department. What we have is a movement, and that's more powerful. So one of the things I'm super excited about is bringing on large communities or other new communities of people. And so I was super excited about the trust group. So they've got about 100,000 people who are joining. I'm excited about Henhouse and what Alex is doing with Ditto, because it gives the community collaboration stuff of Mastodon, but you get the freedom of Nostr. And then I have a few projects I'm working on myself. One is in the late 1990s, I started a calendar activist site called protest.net, and I have been migrating it to Nostr, so it'll run on an open network. And There's actually not a lot of software to build. It's like Flockster plus a custom relay plus Ditto and a few other things. And then the other thing we're doing is we're acquiring causes.com. Back in Australia, I talked about collaborating with them, and this is a community of 300,000 users. 100,000 of them open the daily email every single day. And they're wanting to collaborate, and they're wanting to talk about politics, and they're wanting to build things, and they want to have a larger impact in the world. And so what we're going to do is we're going to add crowdfunding. We're not going to tell them it's a wallet, but we're going to let them collect money and bring it in. And then we're going to let them decide where to allocate those funds. And so we're using this open network to make it work. The last thing, I don't have much time, but we should not copy other people's social media protocols and apps just because we're copying them. But when they do things that work, we should consider whether or not it makes sense for ourselves. And here are a few of them. The Blue Sky starter packs, they're basically a list, and they have a special interface, and they encourage users to sign up for them, and they generate custom URLs. So it gives you a bunch of people to follow. We kind of have all the tech to make this work with Lister and a bunch of other stuff. We just don't have it all connected. They're custom feed algorithm stuff. We have custom feed algorithms, but they have these neat, I guess a little ugly, tools for building them. And inside the apps, they make the discovery of them very easy. They encourage things for them. We have DVM and custom feeds, but we only have a few apps that do it, and we don't make it discoverable as people use it. Farcaster has this thing called Frames, which is really awesome because the Yakahone folks have created this Nostr thing called Smart Widgets, which incorporates frames into what we're doing. And so I want to conclude this talk back where I started, which is we've actually come a long ways in the last 2 years as the Nostr community built. We have built hundreds of apps, and we have a vibrant set of community, and we've built a lot of NIPs and a lot of collaboration, but we still have a long ways to go. And we need to keep talking to each other and realizing that, Lightning isn't our only superpower. Another one is all of these apps and the way in which you can collaborate between them, because no one else has that, and people want it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabble.